Hey everybody, thanks for watching. This is the third video in a series about being transformed in Christ. The Bible teaches that the human nature, also called the flesh, is the source of all of our temptations and sins. Now we need to deal with this question. If our nature is the cause of our problems, how do we ever do anything good or righteous? It's because the fleshly nature is not the only force at work in the human mind. God also gives all of us a conscience, an innate sense of right and wrong, a God-given awareness of morality and eternity. Paul makes this very point when he's talking about the Gentiles in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. They didn't receive the written law, but they were still governed by a law. Here's what he says. For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. So the conscience is the law written on the human heart. The conscience is what compels a person to do what's right and avoid what's wrong. The righteous desires of the conscience are at war with the desires of the flesh. The mind or the conscience wills to do good, but the flesh wills to do evil. The mind or the conscience wills to satisfy God, but the flesh wills to satisfy self. A familiar story demonstrates the conflict between the will of the flesh and the will of the mind. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 26, verse 41, when he found his friend sleeping? He said, "Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." In this verse, the spirit refers to the mind, or you might say the conscience. The conscience says stay awake, but the flesh says to go to sleep. The conscience says to trust in the Lord, but the flesh says to be afraid. The conscience says to stand for what's right, but the flesh says to run. And so Paul concludes in Romans chapter 7, verse 25, "So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin." But here's the problem. The flesh eventually wins. The will of the flesh is stronger than the will of the conscience. The human will is not strong enough on its own to defeat the desires of the flesh. Here's how Paul describes this in Romans chapter 7, verses 22 through 24. He says, "For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" So Paul says the flesh wins, and what's worse is the conscience eventually dies. The conscience can become so damaged that it no longer has a meaningful influence on our decision-making. Every person is born with a healthy conscience given by God, but God eventually lets the conscience die if we want it to die. Paul again uses the Gentiles as an example of this in Romans chapter 1. He says in Romans 1 verse 21, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened." There's also Romans 1 verse 24. "Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves." And finally, Romans 1 verse 28. "And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done." So the desire for God is natural, but the desires of the flesh are also natural. And unfortunately, slowly, but surely, inevitably, the desires of the flesh win, and God gives us over to a broken conscience. The conscience gets defiled. Our sense of right and wrong gets twisted. Our sense of duty to God can even be completely destroyed. And our ability to will against the flesh becomes disabled. If it feels like this is a pretty helpless situation, you're exactly right. We sin because we are overwhelmed by the fleshly nature. We sin because we become unresponsive to a dying conscience. So you might think, well, as long as we know God's law, then we can win, right? Well, no, that's not exactly how it works. And that's what we'll talk about in the next lesson. Thanks for watching.